The HOA told me to tear down the dock my grandfather built in 1963, just to clear the president's lake view. They thought a fence and a few angry letters could block my access to the lake. But out here in Montana, the water remembers longer than people. And the day they came for my grandfather's old dock, they woke something they couldn't control. What would you do if you woke up one morning and the whole lake was suddenly yours? The first thing you'd notice wasn't the sign. It was the silence. Willow Ridge Lake, on a summer morning, is supposed to sound alive. Motors coughing awake, kids laughing on the shoreline, the slap of a lure on green water. That morning, all I heard was the wind in the pines and the low murmur of angry voices gathered on the other side of the cove. I stood on my dock, with my boots planted on sun-bleached planks my grandfather had nailed down before I was born. Beside me, my white and blue motorboat bobbed gently, rope squeaking where it was tied to the post. The lake itself was glass, flat, green, and still, like it hadn't figured out yet that the whole valley was about to change. The fishing closed sign hung from a rusting chain between two dock posts, swaying whenever the breeze came through the trees. The letters were big and black, stamped by the state on an aluminum plate you couldn't peel off and throw away. It cut across the dock like a line in the sand. On this side, me, my boat, my land. On the other side, everybody else. "That's him right there," a voice shouted from the shore. "That's the guy who got the whole season shut down." Once you've heard Bethany Whitfield mad at you, you don't forget the pitch. I turned my head just enough to see her. Yellow HOA polo, clipboard under one arm, finger stabbing the air in my direction. Behind her, a knot of HOA members clustered near the public boat ramp, ball caps, life vests, coolers at their feet. Their aluminum fishing boats sat idle on trailers, motors tilted uselessly out of the water. Every single one of them was staring straight at me like I'd walked up and kicked over their campfire. "Morning?" I called, because being polite costs less than a lawyer. My voice carried across the water. "Beautiful day for not fishing." A couple of them swore. One man in a red cap took a step toward the shoreline, like he might try to walk across the lake if he got mad enough. Bethany held out an arm, stopping him, then cupped her hands around her mouth. "You think this is funny, Mr. Remy?" she shouted. "You've cost this community its entire summer season. 40 years of tradition, ruined because you couldn't just follow the rules like everyone else." I let her words hang in the air a moment. Over my shoulder, my cabin sat up on the slope. Red metal roof, cedar siding, and a gravel path cutting through knee-high grass to the dock. The only thing that looked different from the day I signed the deed was the metal chain and that sign humming quietly in the wind. I didn't feel angry, not in that moment. Anger's too hot for mornings like this. What I felt was something colder, something that had settled in my bones months ago when all of this started, a kind of steady defiance. "How did blocking my boat access," I said, loud enough for every neighbor on that shore to hear, "end with all of you losing the lake you thought you owned?" There was a ripple through the crowd. Murmurs, shifting feet, someone's cooler tipping in the gravel. Bethany stiffened like I'd slapped her with a statute. "You did this," she snapped. "You and your complaints and your so-called experts. If you had just taken down that old, dangerous dock when you were told, none of this would have happened. You brought the state into our business." "You're half right," I said. "I did bring the state in. But this?" I tapped the edge of the sign with my knuckles, letting it ring once in the quiet. "This isn't about my dock anymore, Ms. Whitfield. This is about what you and your board tried to build on top of it." Someone from the crowd yelled, "We just want to fish, man." Another added, "My kids wait all year for this." Their frustration was real, and I felt it. I'd grown up on this lake. I knew what it meant to count months by seasons of water. I took a slow breath and let the cool air fill my lungs, taste of pine and damp earth riding on it. I'd spent most of my life around reservoirs and rivers, watching what happened when people thought they could bully water into doing what they wanted. It always pushed back sooner or later. The lake below my dock wasn't angry. Lakes don't get angry. They just remember. "Look," I called. "You want a name to blame, you've got one. Mine, Jake Remy, the guy on the dock. I'll carry that. But if you want the truth, if you really want to know why that sign's hanging there, you might want to ask your board what kind of deals they tried to cut with your lake." Bethany's face went pale, then red. Even from across the water, I could see the tight grip she had on her clipboard, fingers white at the knuckles. She didn't like the word deals being said out loud, not with half the subdivision watching. "You are out of line," she said, voice sharp. "This is an HOA matter, and we will handle it internally. You have already done enough damage." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I stopped something worse." A gust of wind pushed up the surface of the lake, ruffling it into small ripples that slapped against the dock posts. The chain clinked. For a second, nobody talked. You could hear the flag on the ramp flapping and the distant hum of a truck on the county road above the tree line. "This isn't over," Bethany shouted finally, more to her crowd than to me. "We'll appeal this order. We'll get our season back. The association will not be held hostage by one stubborn man and his rotting dock." There it was, the line she should have never said out loud. I smiled, just a little, not enough to look smug, just enough to let her know she wasn't scaring me. "You say hostage," I answered. "The state says habitat. Funny how the same stretch of water can look different depending on whether you're seeing it through money or through the law." She turned away then, barking something at the group, pointing toward their cars and the HOA office up the hill. People started to drift off in clumps, dragging coolers, slamming tailgates. I stayed where I was, fingers resting on the boat's rail, feeling the faint movement of the hull as the water rocked it. The sign creaked again. "You don't get to this kind of morning overnight. You don't wake up one day with a state-issued plate hanging on your dock and your neighbors glaring at you over weekends they think you stole. You get here one letter at a time, one meeting at a time, one bad decision from a board that forgot who actually owns the ground under their rules. To understand this mess, we have to rewind to the day they came for my grandfather's dock. It was late spring when the letter showed up. One of those crisp envelopes that somehow feels judgmental before you even open it. The HOA logo sat embossed in blue, with Willow Ridge Lakeside Association, swirling like it belonged on something far more official than a committee of neighbors who argued about lawn heights. I'd been on my porch that morning, sipping coffee and watching the sun come up over the ridge. The lake was calm enough to mirror the sky, a pale, milky blue that made the whole valley look like it hadn't fully woken up. My dog, Boone, lay asleep at my feet, tail twitching at whatever dream kept him busy. That was the last moment of peace I had for a long time. Inside the envelope was a notice typed in the kind of font that tries a little too hard to look formal. "Non-compliant dock. Remove within 30 days. I remember reading that line twice, letting the weight of it settle. Then I looked out the window at the dock itself, the old wooden planks stretching just far enough into the lake to tie up a small boat, weathered smooth by 60 Montana winters. My grandfather's initials, JR, were still carved into the third post, faded but unmistakable. He'd put them there in 1963, the year the county finished clearing the lake after the flood. I walked down the slope toward the dock, coffee still warm in my mug, the gravel crunching under my boots. It wasn't just a structure to me. It was the first place I'd learned how to tie a knot strong enough to hold a drifting boat. The place where Granddad taught me how to read ripples on the surface and guess where the fish were bedding. The place where he'd sit and smoke a thin cigar when he thought no one was watching. I rested a hand on the nearest post. The wood was warm already, catching early sunlight. That dock was the one constant through every storm this lake had thrown at us. And now an HOA notice was telling me I had 30 days to erase it. Later that afternoon, after the disbelief had faded into something sharper, I called the number on the letter. It rang twice before a curt voice answered. Lakeside Shores Association, this is President Bethany Whitfield. Her tone carried the polished kind of confidence that comes from spending too many years being obeyed. I introduced myself, explained the issue, and asked why a dock older than the HOA itself was suddenly considered a problem. Bethany sighed the way a teacher sighs at a student who should already know the answer. Mr. Remy, our architectural guidelines require all lakefront structures to meet current safety and aesthetic standards. Your dock predates the association, yes, but grandfathered structures lose protection when the property changes ownership. That's not how state law reads, I said, keeping my tone level. The dock is stable and well maintained. The deed mentions lake access. There has to be. This isn't state court, Mr. Remy. Her voice tightened with something, almost mocking. This is Willow Ridge. Our covenants are not optional. Something in her tone pressed against the oldest part of me, the part that had spent 20 years designing and inspecting dams where a single miscalculation could drown half a valley. I'd dealt with inspectors, engineers, commissioners, and bureaucrats from Helena to DC. None had managed the level of condescension Bethany delivered in one breath. I'm not removing that dock, I said quietly. It belongs here. You have 30 days, she replied. After that, daily fines accrue, and believe me, our board follows through. The call ended with a sharp click. That evening, I took Boone for a walk down the shoreline trail. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the path. I heard voices ahead, Bethany's unmistakable pitch, joined by a lower man's voice I recognized as Marcus Reed, one of the board members who always looked like he'd swallowed something sour. They stood just past the property line, unaware I'd stepped off the trail behind them. I don't care what sentimental story he has, Bethany said. That dock blocks the lake view from my living room, and if we're going to build the new HOA pier this summer, we need that site cleared. Marcus grunted approval. Preston said the same thing. Construction needs to start before the festival. Can't do that with some old relic sitting there. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let their words sink in like gravel thrown into water, ripples going out in every direction. This wasn't about safety or aesthetics or bylaws. It was about a view and a deal. Granddad always told me, if you want to know a man's real intention, listen when he thinks no one's around. That night, their intentions were loud enough to echo. I walked back to the cabin as the sky shifted from orange to deep purple. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. Boone sniffed the trail ahead, oblivious to the storm rolling in behind us. Inside, I laid the notice on the kitchen table and traced the bold letters again. 30 days. Remove or be fined. Remove something my grandfather built by hand. Remove a piece of family history because a woman with a clipboard wanted a better view from her living room. Anger rose in me like heat off summer asphalt, but I held it tight. If there's one thing being a dam engineer teaches you, it's how to handle pressure. Slow, controlled, precise. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down, and looked out toward the dock. If they wanted a fight, I said to Boone, who thumped his tail, they picked the wrong engineer. I meant it. But even then, I didn't understand just how fast they'd test me. 2 mornings after that call with Bethany, before the dew had even burned off the grass, I heard the grind of a diesel engine out front. The rumble vibrated through the cabin floorboards, the low kind of noise that says someone's come to change something whether you like it or not. Boone leapt up, barking once before running to the window. I followed him and pulled back the curtain. A white HOA utility truck idled at the bottom of my slope, hazard lights blinking in the soft morning light. Two men in reflective vests stood beside it, unrolling a spool of metal fencing wire, while another carried steel posts over his shoulder. Two more workers were unloading a prefabricated gate, thick, gray, industrial-looking, something you'd expect around a construction zone, not a lakeshore. I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine sap and damp soil. A thin mist hung over the water, still drifting in patches from the cove. The beauty of it made the scene below look even more out of place. "Morning," I called as I walked down the stone path. "Mind telling me what you're doing on my property?" One of the workers straightened up, wiped his forehead, and pointed toward the gravel road. "We've got authorization from the HOA, sir. Safety installation." "Safety," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Before he could answer, a familiar voice floated down from behind the truck. "Mr. Remy!" Bethany stepped into view, clipboard tucked under her arm like it was a sheriff's badge. Her yellow HOA polo was spotless, not a wrinkle on it. Her hair was pulled so tight that I wondered how she managed an expression at all. "We're installing a temporary barrier to prevent unsafe access to common property," she said, almost singing the words. "Common property?" I asked. "That path runs from my cabin straight to my dock. This isn't the community walkway." She gave a delicate shrug. The board reviewed the maps again. Turns out a portion of the shoreline land, about 6 feet, right where your steps meet the bank, is technically part of the association's right-of-way. Liability concerns, you understand. "I understand that you're stretching that right-of-way like taffy," I said. "And I understand that you think you can use that to block me from my own dock." Bethany's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We're not blocking you. We're protecting the community. But if the barrier makes the area inaccessible for the time being, well, that's simply unfortunate." One of the workers began pounding a metal post into the earth. The sharp clang echoed across the lake, startling a flock of ducks near the reeds. Boone growled low beside me, tail stiff. "You didn't even wait for the appeal period," I said. "You skipped straight to enforcement." "Emergency powers," she replied, tapping her clipboard. "Section 5.4 of the HOA bylaws allows us to act swiftly when there are immediate safety risks, and your dock, in its current state, certainly qualifies." I forced a breath through my nose. "There's nothing unsafe about that dock. You haven't even inspected it." "We don't need to," she said. "The board has made its decision." The workers continued installing the posts, forming a straight line across the narrow strip of shoreline. The metallic rattle of the fencing unspooling grated under my skin like a burr caught in wool. Every clang, every scrape was another inch of my access slipping away. "Hey," I called out to the nearest worker. "Do you realize you're blocking me from reaching that dock?" He hesitated a second before answering. "Sir, we just do what the job order says." I looked at the gate leaning against the truck bed. Heavy steel, chain latch already attached. This wasn't safety equipment. It was a wall. "Unreal," I whispered. Bethany stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You could avoid all this, you know. Remove the dock, bring the shoreline into compliance, and we can work together." I met her gaze. "You mean give up what belongs to me?" "I mean follow the rules," she said. "Everyone else does." "Everyone else," I echoed. "Or just the ones you feel like enforcing them on?" For the first time, her composure cracked. Only a flicker, but I saw it. The slight tightening around her jaw. The faint twitch of irritation. Then she reset her expression. "The dock goes," she said coolly. "Or your access does. Your choice." A worker called out, "Gates ready!" Two men lifted it and swung it into place. They attached the chain to the posts, fed a padlock through, and snapped it shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot across the quiet cove. I walked to the gate slowly, running my fingers along the cold metal. Beyond it, just 20 feet away, my boat swayed gently beside the dock, sun lighting the water around it. So close I could smell the faint tang of lake algae and wet rope. Bethany stood beside me, inspecting her handiwork. "You may keep your dock, Mr. Remy," she said lightly. "You just won't be using it." For a moment, I said nothing. Not because I didn't have a response, but because I needed the silence. I needed to let the anger settle, slow and heavy, the way reservoir water settles before a floodgate opens. Finally, I stepped back, folded my arms, and looked her in the eye. "You know, Otsao," I said, "you're right about one thing." She lifted an eyebrow. "This gate changes things." A hint of triumph touched the corner of her mouth as she turned away. "Glad we understand each other." As she walked back toward her truck, clipboard tucked tight, I watched the reflection of the metal fence shimmer on the lake's surface. Boone pressed against my leg, whining softly, sensing something was wrong. I knelt and scratched, behind his ears. "Don't worry, boy," I murmured. "I built dams to hold back 1,000,000 tons of pressure. I can handle one HOA president." But the truth was, this wasn't about pressure anymore. This was about territory, hers, mine, and the strip of shoreline where our worlds collided. The gate stood there like a challenge planted in the Montana dirt. And I never walked away from a challenge. That afternoon, after the HOA trucks disappeared up the gravel road and the echo of their engines faded into the pines, I walked back toward my cabin, with Boone trotting beside me. The sun was beginning to tilt west, throwing long shadows across the slope and turning the lake a deeper shade of green. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, except for the steel barrier cutting across the shore like a scar. Inside, the cabin felt strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks in after a punch lands. I hung my hat on the hook by the door and laid my hand flat on the kitchen table, grounding myself. The anger was still there, sitting low and heavy, but steady, focused. I'd learned long ago that you don't face a flood by swinging your fists at it. You build a plan. You find the weak point. Then you use the pressure against itself. I grabbed the old metal filing box Granddad kept under the counter. Inside were folded documents, brittle with age but still sharp where it mattered. The original land deed, maps from the 1960s, showing how the shoreline was surveyed after the flood, permits he'd filed for the dock construction, and even a few letters he'd written to the county years ago about maintaining safe boat access. I set everything out on the table, smoothing the creases. The papers smelled faintly of dust and cedar oil, Granddad's two favorite things. Boone circled near my chair, restless but quiet, watching me sort through the past like pieces of a puzzle I was assembling for the second time in my life. As I studied the maps, something clicked. The boundary lines between private shoreline, state buffer, and community paths weren't as simple as Bethany acted like they were. A thin strip, 16 feet wide, ran along the lake's edge marked State Resource Buffer. It wasn't owned by the HOA. It wasn't even under their jurisdiction. It was protected land, meant to preserve ecological access for the entire lake. And right through that buffer, the HOA had sunk steel posts into the earth. "Well," I muttered, tracing the line again, "that's going to be a problem. Just not for me." The next step was trickier. HOA bylaws were a labyrinth written by people who liked the feeling of authority, and navigating them required patience and a strong stomach. I spent hours flipping through PDFs I'd downloaded months earlier, scrolling through sections with titles like Architectural Consistency and Common Property Usage. Nothing justified a barrier blocking riparian access. Nothing allowed the president to override state jurisdiction. Nothing said they could fence off water that didn't belong to them. But the part that grabbed my attention was an amendment tucked into the bylaws from 7 years ago. A clause permitting the board to fast-track construction projects in partnership with approved developers during periods of community enhancement. Approved developers. Enhancement projects. That was interesting. Just after sunset, headlights lit my window. A familiar knock followed. 3 short taps, Ernest Walker's style. Ernest was the kind of neighbor who still believed in shaking hands and borrowing sugar. He'd been fishing this lake longer than most people in Willow Ridge had lived here. I opened the door. Ernest stood there in his denim jacket, cap low, hands stuffed in the pockets like he expected trouble. "Heard about the fence," he said without preamble. "News travels fast around this lake. Faster when someone puts up steel like they're guarding Fort Knox," he grumbled. "Mind if I step in?" I waved him inside and cleared off a chair. He glanced at the papers scattered on the table, eyebrows rising. "You dive into this mess already?" "Had to," I said. "I'm not tearing down the dock." "Good," Ernest replied. "That dock's older than half the people making these rules." He pulled off his cap and rubbed the back of his neck. "Heard another thing, too. That new fishing pier Bethany keeps talking about? Word is she's been meeting with Preston Hale, contractor out of Pine Bluff. Fella's built piers on 3 other lakes around here. All of them quick, cheap, and noisy as hell." I felt a slow realization crawl up my spine. "You think Bethany's pushing the pier for more than community benefit?" Ernest snorted. "I think she's been promising him the contract since last fall, and that your dock being in the way is real inconvenient for their plans." I let out a long breath. The puzzle pieces were falling into place exactly where I'd feared they would. "Mind taking a look at this?" I asked, handing Ernest the map with the shoreline buffer. He squinted, running a finger along the border. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "That fence is planted right in state jurisdiction. HOA doesn't own this strip. Never has." "Exactly." He looked up, a spark of approval in his eyes. "You filing a complaint?" "I'm filing more than one," I said. "County Land Office, State Department of Natural Resources. Anyone who has a say in shoreline access." "That'll ruffle feathers." "That's the idea." Ernest leaned back in his chair, studying me the way a man studies the sky before a storm. "You remind me of your grandfather," he finally said. "He didn't go looking for a fight either, but he didn't step back from one if someone pushed him into it." I smiled faintly. Let's hope I inherited his aim. After Ernest left, the night settled over the cabin like a blanket. The moonlight reflected off the lake, silver and quiet. The dock a dark silhouette against the shimmering water. The steel gate glinted faintly in the distance, cold and stubborn. I turned on my desk lamp and pulled the laptop closer. One document at a time, I began drafting formal complaints, attaching scans of deeds and maps. I worked methodically, cross-checking state code, sections, referencing environmental statutes, citing riparian rights. By the time I finished, my eyes burned and my neck ached. But the file folder on my screen was full: complaints, evidence, photographs, letters drafted and addressed. I sent the first one to the county, then the second, then the third. The lake outside was as still as polished stone, but beneath the surface the current was shifting. I could feel it. Something was beginning to move, slow but unstoppable. "Time to bring the state into this," I said softly to the empty room. Boone lifted his head as if he knew something important had just started. And in a way, it had. The morning after I sent the complaints, the lake was wrapped in a pale fog, a thin silver veil drifting low over the water, making the pines on the far shore look like shadows of themselves. I stood on the porch with a cup of hot coffee, feeling the chill creep through my flannel sleeves. The steel gate down by the shore glinted faintly through the mist, looking even more out of place than it had the day before. My phone buzzed. Unknown Montana number. Mr. Remy? A voice said, calm and professional. This is Daniel Ortiz with the Department of Natural Resources. I received your shoreline complaint. I straightened. That was fast. We prioritize cases involving potential access violations and environmental impact, he replied. I'd like to schedule an assessment of the area as soon as possible. When can you be here? I asked. There was a pause, just long enough to make me wonder if he'd change his mind. I'm already on the road, he said. 20 minutes. I ended the call, slipped on my boots, and headed down the slope toward the dock. Boone trotted beside me, occasionally stopping to sniff the damp earth. The air was cold enough that every breath carried a little cloud with it. It reminded me of mornings when Granddad and I would head out before sunrise, our breath floating like ghosts over the water. By the time I reached the gate, a dark green DNR truck rolled around the bend in the road and parked at the edge of my property. A tall man stepped out, wearing a field vest, waders strapped around one leg, and carrying a silver metal case. Mr. Remy, he said, offering a firm handshake. His grip told me he spent more time outdoors to Chabansos than behind a desk. Thank you for contacting us. I understand you're dealing with an HOA barrier obstructing lake access? That's one way to put it, I said. He walked to the fence and ran his hand along the steel post, frowning. This is not permitted here. He knelt and inspected the ground where the post had been sunk. They drove this straight into the state buffer. That's what my deed maps show. I watched him study the soil. But I'm guessing you didn't come just to look at fence posts. No, he said. Your report mentioned unusual bass activity beneath your dock. I nodded. Every spring, the water boils with them down there. Granddad used to say that spot was one of the best spawning beds on the entire lake. Thought it might be worth checking. Daniel stood, brushing soil from his gloves. If that's true, then this shoreline may be part of an active breeding ground, and any construction, noise, or restricted access could damage it. The words hung in the air like a spark waiting for fuel. I need to get a closer look, he added. I unlocked the top of the fence's chain and held it open just wide enough for him to slip through. He carried his metal case down the steps to the waterline with measured steps, like a man stepping into a chapel. Boone watched him go, tail wagging uncertainly. Daniel opened the case and pulled out a small underwater camera, a water sampler, and a strip thermometer. Kneeling at the edge, he dipped instruments into the lake, letting the readings stabilize. The water shivered in tiny ripples around his hand. Temperature's perfect, he murmured. Oxygen levels are high. Let's try the camera. He slipped the device below the surface and watched the live feed on a small tablet. I leaned in, the cold air pricking my skin as the screen lit up. Gravel beds, circular depressions, movement. A flash of mottled silver green darted across the lens, quick as a whisper. Daniel inhaled sharply. Spotted bass. And not just one, a cluster. And look at this. He pointed to a small dark patch that almost looked like a shadow. Egg nests. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The lake gave a soft lap against the dock posts, as if acknowledging the discovery. This is significant, he said finally. Very significant. This area should have been surveyed before any new pier construction was even approved. I looked at him. So what does that mean for all of this? I asked, motioning toward the fence and the cluster of HOA boats across the lake. It means, he said slowly, that if this spawning ground is confirmed, the entire shoreline within several hundred feet would require a temporary protection order. That includes fishing restrictions and a halt on any construction activity. Meaning the new HOA pier? I asked. He nodded. Meaning everything. The weight of his words settled between us like fog falling through trees. I heard the crunch of gravel on the trail. Marcus Reed stood on the rise above us, hands in his pockets, watching with the stiff posture of a man who didn't like what he was seeing. "What exactly are you doing?" Marcus called down, his voice tight. "Scientific assessment," Daniel replied calmly. "Routine." Marcus took a slow step forward. "Eleanor's going to want to know why the state is poking around." "I'm sure she will," Daniel said, without looking away from the water. Marcus scowled at me, then turned and strode off the trail, pulling out his phone. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know who he was calling. Daniel packed up his case. "I'll need to submit these samples to the lab," he said. "But based on what we just saw, I feel confident recommending a temporary halt to any shoreline changes." "You do what you have to do," I said. He glanced back at the fence, then at my dock. "Mr. Remy, if what's here is protected habitat, that fence shouldn't just be removed. It never should have been installed." "I figured as much." He closed the case with a soft click. "Expect follow-up from the state within a week." The fog had lifted now, revealing the wide sweep of the lake and the thin ribbon of shore stretching from my cabin to the HOA's domain. The water glinted under the rising sun, gentle and quiet, unaware that its peace was about to become the center of a storm. As Daniel drove away, I stood alone with Boone at my side, listening to the soft splash of small fish beneath the dock. "If that report holds," I whispered, "it won't be my dock they're tearing down." A breeze swept across the lake, carrying the early scent of pine resin and cold water. It'll be their whole summer. I didn't know then just how literal those words would become. But the lake always has a way of remembering the truth before people do. 3 mornings after Daniel's visit, I stepped out onto the porch and found a white envelope sitting squarely in the center of my welcome mat. No postage, no footprints, just the state seal embossed in blue. Boone sniffed it, then looked up at me like he already knew. I opened it with my thumb, feeling the paper shiver in the breeze. It was a temporary habitat protection order issued under Montana Environmental Code Section 4211. In plain English, the entire northern half of Willow Ridge Lake, the half controlled by the HOA, was now closed to recreational fishing, boat launching, shoreline construction, pier installation, any activity within 500 feet of the identified spawning habitat. And at the bottom, in bold, this order shall remain in effect until further ecological review. Violations subject to civil penalties. I let out a long, low whistle. The HOA had wanted control of the lake. Now they didn't have control of a single inch of it. I heard shouting before I even reached the shoreline. By the time I walked through the pines and came out beside the steel barrier, the whole scene had already erupted into a kind of lakeside circus. 6 HOA members stood clustered on their side of the property line, all wearing bright yellow polo shirts with the Willow Ridge emblem stitched over the chest. Their fishing boats bobbed uselessly in the shallows. Some men still wore life vests, holding tackle boxes like they didn't know where to put them. Bethany Whitfield stood at the center of the crowd, her beige visor tilted low over her eyes, gripping a clipboard so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "What do you mean closed?" she snapped at the DNR officer posting the state notice onto a wooden stake. "You can't shut down a 40-year community tradition." "It's not up to me, ma'am," the officer said, keeping his voice polite. "Environmental protection order, effective immediately." "But our season starts in 2 days," someone shouted. "This is economic sabotage." The officer didn't even blink. "Sir, the order is clearly posted. These areas must remain undisturbed until further review." Bethany whirled on me then. She must have sensed me before she actually saw me. Her eyes narrowed like she was squinting through a rifle sight. "This is your doing," she hissed. "You filed the complaint. You brought them here." I kept my hands easy at my sides. I filed nothing but the truth. "You've robbed this community," she said, her voice cracking. "The festival brings thousands of dollars into local business. You've destroyed our season." I nodded slowly toward the notice. "Looks like the lake made the call, not me." "You think this is funny?" she snapped. "No," I said, "but I think it's fair." For a moment, the only sound was the soft lap of water against the aluminum boats. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Then someone yelled from the back, "We want our fishing! This is ridiculous!" Another man, Greg, the HOA's self-appointed security coordinator, threw his hands up. "We should just fish anyway. What's the state going to do, arrest all of us?" The DNR officer turned sharply. "Sir, unauthorized fishing in a protected habitat zone carries a civil penalty of up to $5,000 per incident." Greg shut his mouth so fast his teeth clicked. Bethany was trembling. Not with fear, with anger. Pure, boiling, just about to splatter anger. "You haven't won," she said to me quietly. "Don't think for a second this is over." "I didn't start anything," I said. "You wanted my dock, and you dug too deep." Her nostrils flared. "You don't understand the size of the mistake you've made." Behind her, the HOA members hovered helplessly beside their boats, staring at the "fishing closed" signs now hanging every few hundred feet. Their fishing rods drooped like wet flags. A few muttered curses drifted across the water. It hit me then, how the lake had gone silent. No kids laughing, no motors revving, no cast lines whipping the air, just wind in the trees and the slow creak of dock ropes. A 40-year tradition had stopped breathing in a single morning. And the people who'd tried to choke off my access to the lake were now watching the lake choke off theirs. I walked back toward my cabin, Boone trotting ahead, tail swinging. Halfway up the trail, I paused and turned, looking down over the shoreline. Bethany was still standing there, clutching her clipboard, staring at the closed water like it had betrayed her personally. "This isn't over," she mouthed again. But her voice didn't carry. For the first time since this whole mess started, she wasn't the one in control. The bylaws couldn't save her. The fines couldn't touch me. The gate couldn't stop the truth. And the lake, my grandfather's lake, had spoken louder than any HOA president ever could. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet understanding settled over me. Bethany wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. And the next move she made would be the one that broke this whole thing open. It started with the flyers, bright orange sheets taped to mailboxes, tucked into screen doors, fluttering against porch rails like warning flags. Emergency community meeting. Mandatory attendance. The word mandatory was underlined 3 times, like she was summoning an army instead of neighbors. By late afternoon, trucks and SUVs rolled into the gravel lot beside the community boathouse, tires crunching like a long, low growl. Folks climbed out holding folding chairs, clipboards, coolers, anything to make the moment feel less like a trial and more like a gathering. But the air was thick. Nobody had been able to fish all week, and the silence on the lake had turned into something heavy. Boone and I walked down the path toward the boathouse, pine needles soft underfoot. Sunlight skated across the lake in shivering lines, but even the water seemed tense, expectant. Inside, the place was already packed. They'd rearranged the room so that rows of metal chairs faced a makeshift podium. An old oak table dragged to the center, polished so hard the wood looked startled. On the wall behind it hung framed photos of past fishing festivals, grinning kids holding prize-winning bass, men in waders, families gathered for lakefront picnics. The history everyone claimed to love, though some seemed willing to bulldoze it for convenience. Bethany Whitfield stood front and center, visor removed, hair pulled tight like she was bracing for impact. Marcus Hale hovered behind her, arms folded, chin raised, a shadow who wanted to be a second sun. The murmuring crowd hushed when she rapped the table with her knuckles. "Thank you all for coming," she said, voice trembling with something that wasn't humility. "We're facing an unprecedented crisis, and it's clear who's responsible." Dozens of heads turned toward me. I felt eyes like spotlights. Accusation, confusion, betrayal. I didn't hold their stares, just kept steady, breathing the way my grandfather taught me out on the water. Slow, measured, unshakable. Bethany continued. "Our fishing season, the heart of our community, is under threat because one homeowner decided to weaponize environmental loopholes." A few people muttered. Someone hissed. Another shook his head. "That's not accurate," I began, but Bethany talked over me, raising her voice. "This isn't about one dock. This is about someone trying to undermine everything we've built. Close our lake? Sabotage our pier? Destroy our traditions? I won't stand for it, and neither should you." She stepped aside, revealing a flip chart covered in maps, graphs, and highlighted sections of the bylaws, all orchestrated to tell her story, not the truth. But I'd come prepared. When she finally paused, I walked to the front, the floorboards creaking under my boots. A ripple of whispers followed. Some people pulled back. Others leaned forward, set a stack of documents on the oak table: county maps, ownership records, water surveys, and printouts from the state. The paper hit the wood with a soft thump that sounded louder than her whole speech. "You deserve the truth," I said, "not theatrics." Bethany stiffened. "Jake, this isn't your turn." "It's the community's turn," I replied, "and they're entitled to facts." Someone in the back said, "Let him talk," and a few murmurs of agreement rose up. So I began. I walked them through the shoreline buffer, 16 feet of state jurisdiction that the HOA had zero legal right to fence, block, or claim. I showed them the state law affirming riparian access and how cutting off my path wasn't just harassment, it was illegal. Then I lifted the map of the lakebed survey Daniel and I had documented. The room quieted, a slow hush rolling from one side to the other. "This," I said, tapping the shaded region beneath my dock, "is a spawning ground. Not loophole fishing, not manipulation. A protected ecosystem, one your peer project would have destroyed." People leaned in, eyes narrowing at the layers Bethany had never bothered to share. Then came the moment that shifted everything. I produced the last page, a printout, verifying the financial tie between Bethany and Preston Hale's construction company, stamped with state business records. Gasps, a dropped water bottle, silence like a held breath. Bethany lunged for the paper, but I slid it away. "You planned a pier on protected waters," I said, "and you planned to profit from it." Residents looked back and forth between her and the evidence, voices rising in confusion, anger, disbelief. "That's a lie," Bethany whispered, but it sounded more like a hope than a defense. Before anyone could respond, the side door creaked open, and in walked two representatives from the Department of Natural Resources, burgundy uniforms, state badges glinting. The room froze. The taller one, a woman with braided hair and calm, assessing eyes, stepped forward. "We received community inquiries requesting clarification," she said. "We're here to confirm that the environmental findings are valid and that the proposed pier site violates state code." Bethany's jaw fell open. Marcus paled. People stared at me, not with anger this time, but with dawning realization. Twist delivered. The crowd didn't roar. They didn't shout. It was worse. They began to question each other. Did she know? Was this the plan all along? Why didn't she tell us there were protected fish? My grandson just bought new gear for the tournament. Is this why she rushed the vote? Bethany raised her hands like she could quiet a storm. Everyone, just listen. But someone in the second row stood. Victor Ramirez, former board member, Vietnam vet, man who'd seen enough power trips to recognize one from across a lake. Bethany, he said, voice gravelly and steady, we trusted you. His words landed like an anchor dropped in deep water. He turned to the crowd. I move for a vote of no confidence. Gasps, a few nods. One person clapped before catching themselves. Bethany sputtered. This is ridiculous! You can't… But the room wasn't listening to her anymore. They were listening to the truth. I stepped back, letting the community confront what they already suspected. Boone, waiting by the doorway, thumped his tail once, as if sensing the shift in the air. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I wasn't the one on trial. Bethany was, and she knew it. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for allies in a room full of people who'd just discovered they'd been played. She wasn't regrouping anymore. She was unraveling. For a long moment, no one spoke. Just the scrape of a chair leg and the low hum of the fluorescent lights hanging overhead. The DNR officers stood still as carved figures. The lake beyond the boathouse windows flashed silver under the sinking sun, as if silently witnessing the undoing of a woman who'd believed she ruled it. Victor Ramirez remained standing, shoulders squared, boots planted as firm as an old pine. We can't keep pretending this is leadership, he said. His voice had the calm gravity of someone who'd lived through storms far worse than HOA politics. We need honesty, not backroom deals. Someone near the front snapped, seconded, another, third. And suddenly the whole room shifted. Not loud, not chaotic, but with a collective exhale, like everyone had been holding their breath for years without knowing it. Bethany slammed her hand onto the oak table. This is not a formal session. You can't just… But Diana Foster, the environmental attorney who'd moved to Willow Ridge last spring, rose from her seat. Slim, sharp-eyed, and steady in a way that drew attention without asking for it. With respect, Diana said, this is a community meeting with over 50 homeowners present. A motion was made, seconded, and acknowledged by the body. That is, by every definition in your own bylaws, valid grounds to proceed. Bethany's face went pale, then flushed, blotchy red rising under her skin. You're twisting the rules. Diana raised an eyebrow. No, I'm reading them. Someone in the back let out a low, appreciative whistle. The crowd began murmuring again, quieter, but more confident. People exchanging weary glances, nodding at one another, the way neighbors do when they find out they've all been enduring the same storm in silence. Bethany gripped the table like she might flip it. This is ridiculous. I have served this community for 15 years. And look where we are, Victor replied. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't sharp. It was simply true. Bethany opened her mouth, but Marcus stepped forward, voice tight. Let's all take a breath. There's no need for a vote tonight. But the room had already moved beyond him, beyond her. Change has a certain sound when it's coming. Quiet at first, then unmistakable. A woman in the second row raised her hand. I've lived here 20 years, and I've never felt scared to speak until Bethany began threatening fines over my garden fence. Another joined in. My son got a letter last fall claiming his kayak rack violated community harmony. What does that even mean? Bethany fined me for having a shed 1 inch taller than regulation, an older man added. 1 inch. Selective enforcement, someone shouted. Conflict of interest, another called. It was as if the truth had been fermenting for years, sealed up tight, and tonight someone finally pulled the cork. Bethany tried one more time. All of you, listen to yourselves. You're letting an outsider divide you. He's new here. He doesn't understand our traditions. I stayed silent. This wasn't my fight. Not this part. This was theirs. It had always been theirs. They just hadn't seen it yet. Diana raised her chin. A vote has been proposed. I ask the community, all in favor of removing Bethany Whitfield as HOA president, raise your hand. Hands went up slowly at first, then faster, in dozens. A forest of raised arms. Victor raised his. Diana raised hers. Even Harold Schmidt, the quiet board elder, lifted his trembling hand. Only 3 people kept their arms glued to their sides. Marcus and 2 newer homeowners who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Then the hands came down. Diana's voice remained calm. All opposed? 3 hands lifted. The room went still again. Everyone seemed to be listening for something. The old power shifting out, new air moving in. The vote carries, Diana said. By majority decision, Bethany Whitfield is hereby removed as president of the Willow Ridge HOA. There was no applause, no cheering, just the long, steady creak of one era ending and another beginning. Bethany stared at the room, eyes wide, breath unsteady. You're making a mistake, she whispered. A terrible mistake. Diana stepped closer. Bethany, please take your seat. Bethany didn't. She dropped her clipboard, the metal clasp snapping against the floor like a gunshot. Papers scattered. She turned, pushing past Marcus as she stormed toward the exit. But before she reached the door, she paused and looked back at me. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. You think you've won, Jake Remy, but you have no idea what's coming. Then she walked out into the sinking Montana light. The door shut behind her with a tired thud. No one spoke. Not at first. They looked at each other, looked at me, looked at the papers on the floor. Then Diana took a slow breath. We'll nominate interim leadership shortly, but for now, I think we all need a moment. Victor walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. You did the right thing, he said, even if she won't ever admit it. Wasn't about being right, I said quietly. It was about the lake. And that, he said, is why we trust you. Outside, the lake lay still, reflecting the first stars beginning to appear. Boone nudged my hand, sensing the shift, tail sweeping the ground softly. The queen had fallen, but something in her parting words told me she wasn't done. People like Bethany don't disappear when they lose power. They reappear when they find leverage. The queen had fallen, but something in her parting words told me she wasn't done. People like Bethany don't disappear when they lose power. They reappear when they find leverage. I learned that lesson again the following Saturday morning, right as the first drops of a summer storm began tapping against my cabin's tin roof. The lake was glassy and gray, the kind of gray that makes everything quiet. Mountains softened, pines leaning still, water barely rippling. I was frying eggs when Boone lifted his head with a low growl. Before I could check the window, heavy footsteps came up the porch steps and stopped right outside my door. Then, 3 sharp knocks. Not neighborly, not polite, official. When I opened the door, a man in a rain-darkened coat stood there holding a thick envelope sealed with blue binding tape. Mr. Remy? He asked. That's me. He handed over the envelope with both hands, like it might explode if mishandled. You've been served. Boone barked once, deep and offended. The man didn't linger, just turned, pulled up his hood, and walked briskly down the steps, disappearing into the shifting curtain of rain. I stared at the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have, like the weight inside wasn't paper but consequence. I tore the seal and slid the packet out. The first page was bolded. Complaint for damages, Whitfield versus Remy and Willow Ridge, HOA. I exhaled slowly. There it was. Bethany's leverage. A 27-page lawsuit, printed on ivory stock, accusing me and the new HOA of interfering with community projects, causing financial losses to the subdivision, intentional emotional distress, defamation, tortious interference with contractual relationships, and, my personal favorite, creating an adversarial environment detrimental to harmonious community living. I flipped through the pages. Every paragraph was loaded with legal phrasing designed to intimidate. She'd even provided affidavits from two so-called experts who claimed my environmental concerns were exaggerated and scientifically unsound. Neither of them had ever set foot in Montana. Outside, thunder rolled low across the lake. I set the papers down and rubbed a hand across my jaw. Boone leaned his head against my leg, sensing the shift the way dogs do. I wasn't worried for myself. Not exactly. I'd dealt with bureaucracies big enough to control rivers. But the new HOA board? Diana? Victor? They didn't ask for this. They didn't deserve to be dragged into a fight that had started with nothing more than a warped sense of power. When the rain eased up, I drove straight to Diana Foster's house. She opened the door wearing jeans, reading glasses perched on her head. "Let me guess," she said. "You got one too." She held up an identical envelope. We sat at her dining table, papers spread out beneath a warm lamp. Outside, rain soaked the pines, dripping steadily from branch to branch. "This is a slap lawsuit," Diana said, tapping the papers with the back of her pen. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. Classic intimidation tactic. Big, loud, and almost always meritless." I nodded. "So she's trying to scare us into folding." "She's trying to drain your bank account," Diana corrected. "If we fight this case on her terms, we'd spend 50 grand before the first hearing. Then we don't fight on her terms." She smiled faintly. "Exactly." Before she could explain, a knock echoed through the house. After everything, I expected another process server. But when Diana opened the door, in walked Walter Graham, retired judge, fishing vest-wearing sage of Willow Ridge. The man carried 3 things: a leather briefcase, a steaming thermos of coffee, and the kind of confidence you only earn from decades behind a bench. "I heard the witch is swinging again," he said, stepping inside. "Thought you might need a little backup." He plopped the briefcase down on the table, flipped it open, and pulled out case files, precedents, annotated statutes, all organized with frightening precision. "This lawsuit," Walter said, adjusting his glasses, "is going to collapse faster than a rotten dock post, but we're not just getting it dismissed." He pointed his finger for emphasis. "We're countering." Diana looked up. "Anti-slap motion?" "Exactly. We hit back for abuse of process. Make her pay your attorney fees. Teach her there's a cost to weaponizing the courts." I couldn't help but grin. "Walter, you might just be my favorite neighbor." He nodded approvingly. "Good, because we're filing on Monday." The storm outside began to intensify, rain hammering the roof like someone beating out a warning. Lightning flickered across the water. Thunder cracked hard enough to make picture frames tremble on Diana's wall. Walter leaned back in his chair. "Once she sees our motion, she'll know she can't bluff her way through this." "But she's betting we'll be too scared to push back," Diana added. "That's what people like her count on. Fear." I looked down at the papers scattered across the table. "No fear here," I said. Monday came like Judgment Day. We walked into the Flathead County Courthouse, Boone waiting in the truck, tail thumping impatiently, while the mountains loomed behind the building in jagged silhouettes. The hallways were lined with portraits of past judges, men and women who'd carried the burden of Montana justice on their shoulders. Judge Catherine Miller presided that day, a sharp, silver-haired woman whose reputation was legendary. Fair, fearless, unimpressed by theatrics. Bethany sat across the aisle, flanked by two attorneys in matching suits. Her lips were tight, her eyes locked on me with a mixture of triumph and bitterness. When her lawyers finished their dramatic presentation, full of adjectives and accusations, Judge Miller nodded once. "Thank you," she said. "Now let's hear from the defense." Walter stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. Diana stepped beside him. Together, they dismantled Bethany's case like carving warm butter. Her conflict of interest, the ignored environmental assessments, her misuse of authority, the selectively enforced fines, the illegal shoreline modifications, the peer contract with her developer associate. Walter ended with one simple line. "This lawsuit is not about harm done to the plaintiff. It is about the plaintiff trying to silence those who exposed her misconduct." The courtroom was silent. Even the air felt still. Judge Miller sat back. "I've seen enough." Bethany leaned forward, as if hoping for a miracle. "The plaintiff's claims," Judge Miller said, "have no legal merit." Her gavel came down hard. "The case is hereby dismissed with prejudice." Then, turning to Bethany, "And given the evidence of misuse of authority and conflict of interest, this court is forwarding your conduct to the County Ethics Committee for review." A stunned gasp rippled through the room. Bethany didn't gasp. She simply froze, like someone had shut off the world around her. We walked out into clear blue Montana sky. The storm long past, but puddles still shining on the courthouse steps. Boone barked happily when he saw us. Walter scratched his ears. "That," Walter said, "is the sound of leverage slipping out of her hands." But I knew better. The lake wasn't done speaking. Not yet. We walked out into clear blue Montana sky. The storm long past, but puddles still shining on the courthouse steps. Boone barked happily when he saw us. Walter scratched his ears. "That," Walter said, "is the sound of leverage slipping out of her hands." But I knew better. The lake wasn't done speaking. Not yet. The final word didn't come from a gavel or a courtroom. It came from the water itself, weeks later, on the morning the new Willow Ridge Fishing Festival opened under a different kind of light. The air had that early summer warmth, soft and amber, the kind that smells faintly of pine sap and wet stone. A breeze skimmed across the surface of the lake, scattering glittering ripples that danced between the docks. Where once a cold steel fence had cut me off, there was now a clean wooden walkway, planked, stained, and built properly this time, stretching to my dock like a bridge between what we'd survived and what we were becoming. Boone bounded ahead, tail whipping, nose lifted like he couldn't quite believe the lake was ours again. To be honest, neither could I. The community had gathered early, kids tugging coolers across gravel, fathers adjusting rods, mothers tying hats beneath chins. The new HOA president, Diana Foster, stood near the registration table with a clipboard and a smile that wasn't forced for once. The DNR officers were present too, marking off the protected spawning areas with bright orange buoys. They worked calmly, respectfully, clearly proud of what they'd helped preserve. Every few minutes, someone walked up to shake my hand. "Thank you, Jake. You saved the lake. Appreciate what you did for us. You stood up when the rest of us were scared to." It wasn't praise I needed, but it was something I accepted quietly, with the same gratitude my grandfather had shown for a good catch at sunset. Stoic, steady, thankful without making a show of it. The festival didn't feel the same as years past, not because anything was missing, but because something better had taken its place. There were new signs explaining bass ecology. Kids were gathered around a tank with Daniel Ortiz, who was showing them how spawning nests formed in shallow gravel beds. A few old-timers nodded approvingly as Daniel talked. They'd known this lake long before we had paperwork to prove it. "Funny thing," Henry Wilson said, coming up beside me. His flannel sleeves rolled to the elbow. The base are more active than I've seen in years. Protection works, I said. Turns out so does honesty. He gave me a sideways look, half admiration, half apology for not stepping in sooner. I didn't hold it against him. People speak when they're ready. Around mid-morning, the first boats launched from my dock. Slow, respectful, easing across the lake in a way that reminded me of a procession. A few men who once glared at me now offered small nods. It wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding, shift, a beginning. And then, like a ghost drifting through pines, a hush fell. Heads turned toward the gravel road leading to the lake. A white sedan rolled to a stop, dust curling around its tires. The door opened, and Bethany Whitfield stepped out. She didn't look like the woman who'd ruled the HOA for 15 years. Her hair was down, her visor gone, her shoulders slumped in a way I didn't think she was capable of. She clutched a single envelope. No lawyer, no allies, no clipboard armor, just Bethany. The crowd fell silent. Even the water seemed to pause. She approached slowly, hesitant, almost human, and stopped a few feet from me. "I came to drop this off," she said, her voice frayed around the edges. She held out the envelope. I didn't take it right away. She looked down, exhaling. "It's my resignation from the HOA. I sold my house. I'm leaving Willow Ridge." A long moment passed. "Why?" I asked. Her eyes flicked toward the docks, the boats, the children laughing. "Because every time I walk past this lake, I see what I almost destroyed, and I see what I lost trying to control something that wasn't mine." A rare honesty glimmered there, fleeting, maybe real, maybe just exhaustion. But it didn't matter. Some endings don't need fireworks. Some deserve nothing more than a quiet nod from a dock that's seen too much. I finally took the envelope. "Good luck, Bethany." She blinked, surprised. Then she turned and walked away. No threats, no promises. Just a woman stepping out of a story that no longer belonged to her. When she drove off, the lake breathed again. Kids cheered as a huge bass broke the surface near the buoys. Someone shouted, "That's a trophy one!" Boats drifted gently over the deeper waters. The festival surged back to life with new energy, one rooted not in tradition, but in renewal. Later that evening, as the last golden light stretched across the lake, I stood on my dock with Boone lying beside me, paws hanging over the edge. The water glowed like a sheet of molten copper. I thought about my grandfather, his hands on those same railings, the stories he told, the patience he taught. I wondered what he'd think of all this. Probably something simple, probably something wise. Boone nudged my hand. "You're right," I said softly. "We did okay." The lake lapped gently against the posts, a kind of answer. I turned toward the cabin, the day settling behind me like a well-earned rest. "If a HOA ever tries to take what's yours," I murmured, "remember the truth of this place. Because the law, like the lake, remembers. And justice, real justice, always rises. If you've ever stood your ground against an unfair HOA or fought to protect what's yours, drop a simple yes in the comments so folks know they're not alone out here. Justice takes patience, but it always finds its way home. And if you'd like to ride along for more real-world ranch stories and land rights wins, feel free to subscribe. I'd be glad to have you back on the dock with me."